There is going to be the role of a privacy attorney who is going to look at legislation to determine whether or not a breach has occurred and whether notification is required to regulators. Hello and welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Owalabi. Today's review, we're going to be looking at the different concepts associated with the CIPM exam. We're going to be looking specifically at Domain 2. So the CIPM exam, for anybody that's new here and this is your first video, the CIPM is the Certified Information Privacy Manager exam that's offered by the IAPP. Now, my review of the Domain 2 today is going to be on the exam. The effective date for the body of knowledge we're going to be talking about today was September the 1st, 2025, and it was approved on the 16th of January, 2025. So the Domain 2, and we're going to be doing a series on the channel. We're going to be looking domain by domain to really review the different manners and explain different types of concepts that you might encounter when you're doing your studies for this exam. So Domain 2 looks at establishing program governance. And in effect, this looks at different components of the privacy program to include breach response. So we know that the data protection laws look at technical and organizational measures. And as part of an individual's role as a privacy manager, looking at breach response, because essentially we have different types of assets within the organization. And those assets generally will safeguard personal data. Sometimes organizations experience an incident. It could be an inadvertent incident, like an employee sharing different types of information to an individual that they shouldn't have shared it to. It could also be something that is influenced by a bad actor who's trying to infiltrate the organization. There needs to be data breach management within the organization that is developed and implemented by the privacy manager. Now, the data breach management is going to be influenced by legislation, which is where we have the stakeholders that we talked about in Domain 1 that we've identified. Not every organization is going to have a data protection officer. Some are going to have a privacy officer. Some are going to have privacy attorneys. Some are going to have a group of privacy managers. So the preliminary foundation discussed in Domain 1 is going to be very critical in managing data breach responses and how an organization deals with whether it's an inadvertent or it is something that has been attempted by a bad actor, and being able to deal with all types of scenarios that could be encountered when it comes to breach. Let's also talk about defining the privacy policies that are appropriate for an organization. As part of the governance for an organization, it's going to be very important to define what types of internal documentations or policies are going to be distributed within an organization. So this could look like something that we have a specific privacy policy that we distribute to our suppliers. This is because our suppliers process personal data in X capacity or Y capacity. We have a privacy policy that we distribute towards our employees in X geography. The privacy policy that's distributed to employees in one geography may vary to a different geography, and those are different foundational discussions that need to happen at the executive leadership level, and also understanding the manner in which an organization treats its privacy program. Is the privacy program centralized, meaning that the privacy decisions come from one source? Are the privacy decisions distributed in a decentralized manner, meaning that every single legal entity determines its own specific manner in which to process personal data? Or is there a hybrid mix? Different organizations are going to determine what is appropriate for them, and it's going to be the responsibility of the privacy manager to implement the decisions that have been made at an organizational level on whether centralized, decentralized, or a hybrid model works in facilitating the privacy program. Let's talk about clarifying roles and responsibilities. Now, this is going to be very important. You're going to need to be able to understand exactly who is responsible for what. And the reason being is because we talked about these internal policy documentations. These internal policy documents generally will have an individual who signs off on the policy so that it can be distributed to the respective personnel, and then also who is accountable for each different component of the privacy program. Now, I'd like to give a good example here of the data breach management, because there's going to be lots of roles within an organization who are influenced by data breach. There is going to be the role of a privacy attorney who is going to look at legislation to determine whether or not a breach has occurred and whether notification is required to regulators. There is going to be the investigation of the breach by the security personnel that needs to be detailed in the policy that's distributed amongst employees. There's also going to be the role of the employees, what to do and identify if an incident has occurred and who to report it to. This is why roles and responsibilities are very important. So as you're reviewing the materials that you have for the CIPM, you're going to need to be able to understand who is responsible for what and for each respective policy. Now, if you are reviewing the body of knowledge that I referenced, you'll see that the exam tests in many different ways. Sometimes you will need to recall specific concepts. Sometimes you're going to need to be able to interpret specific concepts. And this is why each domain feeds into one another, because it starts at which types of sectoral or regulatory influences a program has. That is going to influence the type of data breach management that an organization is going to create. And in addition to that, there may be legislative influences that a privacy manager is going to need to obtain additional guidance in drafting these policy documentations. So the privacy manager is going to need to be able to understand who is responsible for what, in being able to define the different roles, whether it's for data breach response or it's for the disclosure or usage of personal information. So being able to define which type of role is responsible for distributing personal data to a supplier, for example, who is going to place certain restrictions on applications that third parties have access to internal to the organization. All of that is going to need to be detailed, but the influences on that internal documentation is going to be essentially coming from how the business operates, which is why it's very important for the privacy manager to be able to understand what the business model is and what the business wants from a executive leadership standpoint. Now, obviously, this is going to be in tandem with guidance that's received by the privacy attorney and by the data protection officer if the business has one. There are certain instances where an organization is actually required based on statute to have a data protection officer, but that is not the case in every single instance. So I really hope you enjoyed this breakdown of Domain 2. If you have specific insights that, if you're looking for recommendations on materials for studying for this particular certification, please leave me a comment below. I really hope you enjoyed this video and the explanation of what you need to know from a concept perspective and how Domain 2 leads into your understanding of the other domains for the CIPM exam. I'll see you in another video.